Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Johnny Carson is about to shake hands with the man who taught a whole country how to laugh. But what Jack Benny whispers into his ear, 4 quiet words, will make Johnny stop breathing, pull off his glasses and cover his entire face with both hands while 300 people watch in silence. And the reason behind those 4 words, it goes back 30 years, to a freezing night when Johnny Carson was a nobody, broke and unknown, and said something to a stranger that he completely forgot by morning. But that stranger never forgot. You will not believe what happens next. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you didn't subscribe. So, if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple. It's a free thing that anybody that watches this show frequently can do to help us here, to keep everything going in this show and the trajectory it's on. So please do double check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. When Jack Benny walked out from behind the curtain on the Tonight Show stage that warm spring evening, the audience did something they did not do for most guests. They stood, 300 people on their feet, before he had said a single word. Because that was the thing about Jack Benny. He did not need a word. He could walk to the center of a stage, stop, turn his head slowly toward the crowd, place one hand flat against his cheek, and say nothing at all, and a room would dissolve into laughter. He had built an entire empire on the things other men were afraid of. The pause, the silence, the space where a lesser comedian would panic and fill the air. Jack Benny lived in that space. He owned it. Younger comics would stand in the wings and watch him do it and shake their heads, because they could feel how dangerous it was, how close he walked to the edge of disaster every single time, holding a room in absolute silence for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, 4, until the tension became unbearable, and then, only then, releasing it with a single arched eyebrow. It looked like nothing. It was the hardest thing in the world, and on this night, he walked into that silence one more time, 70-something years old, moving a little slower than America remembered, but smiling that same patient smile. Johnny Carson stood up to greet him. He almost never stood for a guest, but he stood for Jack Benny, because every comedian in America knew the truth that the public only half understood. Johnny Carson did not invent his timing. He learned it. He learned it as a boy in Nebraska, lying on the floor in front of a radio, listening to a man hold a silence so long that you could hear the entire country leaning forward. Johnny had studied that silence the way a young painter studies a master. And now the master was walking toward him with his hand outstretched, and the two of them met at the edge of the famous desk. They shook hands. The audience kept cheering. Johnny was grinning, gesturing toward the chair, saying something warm and easy. And then Jack Benny did something that was not in any script, not in any pre-interview, not in any plan. He did not let go of Johnny's hand. He leaned in close enough that his mouth was beside Johnny's ear, and he said 4 words so quietly that not even the boom microphone caught them clearly. Johnny Carson went still. The smile did not just fade. It fell off his face. His free hand, the one not trapped in Benny's grip, rose slowly to his chest as if something there had stopped working. He looked at Jack Benny. He looked at him the way you look at a person who has just reached inside you and touched something you had buried so deep you forgot it existed. And then Johnny Carson, the most composed man in the history of American television, the man who had hosted this program for years without ever once losing his footing, pulled off his glasses, sat down hard in his chair, and pressed both hands flat against his face. His shoulders began to shake. The audience, still half standing, did not understand. The laughter died in their throats. Ed McMahon half rose from his seat, his famous booming voice gone completely silent. The orchestra leader lowered his baton. In the control room, the director stopped talking mid-sentence. Because nobody in that building knew what Jack Benny had just whispered. Nobody knew about the night in the winter of 1948, when a 22-year-old nobody with holes in his shoes had said 11 words to a broken man in an empty theater. Nobody knew that those 11 words had kept Jack Benny alive. And nobody, Not even Johnny himself remembered that the nobody who said them had been Johnny Carson. But what Jack Benny was about to reveal would change everything America thought it knew about the funniest man who ever lived. And it all started on the worst night of Jack Benny's life. To understand those 4 whispered words, you have to go back. All the way back, past the fame, past the radio empire, past the television specials and the violin jokes and the 39-years-old running gag, to a cold January night in 1948, in a half-empty theater in the middle of nowhere, when Jack Benny was a man with everything and nothing at the same time. Because here is what the public never understood about Jack Benny. The cheapness was a character. The vanity was a character. The bad violin playing was a joke he let the world believe because it was easier than telling the truth. The truth was that Jack Benny was one of the most generous, most frightened, most lonely men in show business. And in that winter of 1948, he was coming apart at the seams. And almost nobody knew. He had just lost the one person who understood him. Not a wife, not a lover. His oldest friend and writing partner, a man named Daniel, who had been with Jack since the vaudeville days, who knew where every joke was buried, who was the only human being on earth Jack could call at 3 a.m. and simply breathe into the phone without having to be funny. Daniel had died in the fall of 1947, suddenly, a heart that gave out at a typewriter. And after the funeral, after the cards stopped coming and the world moved on, Jack Benny discovered something terrifying. He no longer knew who he was when he was not performing. The laughter had always been the thing that proved he was alive, and now with Daniel gone, the laughter felt like it was happening to a stranger. For weeks after the funeral, Jack would sit in his study with the radio off, holding the telephone, dialing the first 3 numbers of Daniel's house before he remembered there was no one left to answer. He kept catching himself saving up little observations through the day, funny things, small absurd moments, the way you save things for the one person who will understand exactly why they are funny, and then he would remember there was no one to tell them to anymore. The jokes piled up inside him with nowhere to go, and a man whose entire life had been the act of giving things a way to make people laugh discovered that there is nothing lonelier in the world than being funny with no one to be funny for. But what happened next shocked everyone who knew him. Instead of resting, instead of grieving, Jack Benny booked himself a brutal tour of small theaters across the frozen middle of the country. Towns nobody had heard of, stages with bad heating and worse pianos. His agent begged him not to. His friends did not understand. But Jack had a reason he could not explain to any of them. He was running. He was running from the silence of his own house, and the only place he knew how to outrun it was on a stage in front of strangers where the silence belonged to him and not the other way around. And that is how Jack Benny ended up, on a freezing Tuesday night in January, standing in the wings of a theater in a town so small, the marquee outside spelled his name wrong. Wait, do not miss this detail. Because what happened in that theater is the reason all of this matters. The house was half empty. A storm had rolled in, and the roads were bad, and the people who did show up were quiet, tired, bundled in coats because the heat had failed. And Jack Benny, for the first time in his professional life, could not make them laugh. He tried everything. The pauses fell flat. The timing that had never failed him in 30 years suddenly failed him completely. He could feel it happening the way a pilot feels an engine die. He walked off stage early. He did not take a bow. He went back to his dressing room, a cold concrete box with a single bulb, and he sat down in front of a cracked mirror, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he did not want to do this anymore. Any of it. That without Daniel, without the one person who made the work feel like it meant something, he was just an old man making noise in the dark. He sat in that dressing room for a long time. He looked at his own reflection in the cracked glass, split down the middle into 2 faces that did not quite line up, and he thought that was about right. There was the Jack Benny the world owned, the one on the posters, the one they had stood in a storm to come and see, and there was this other man, the one nobody had ever met, the one who was so tired he could feel it in his teeth. He thought about all the Sundays, all the millions of living rooms, all the families who had let him into their homes for 30 minutes a week, who trusted him to make the hard years bearable, and he wondered if any of it had been real, or if he had simply been a voice in a box easily replaced, easily forgotten the moment the dial was turned. The theater emptied out, the crew went home, and eventually a young man knocked on the door. Just a kid, really, 22 years old. He had been hired for almost nothing to help with the local radio promotion, to carry equipment, to do whatever needed doing. He had holes in his shoes and a thin coat, and a face that had not yet learned to hide anything. He had been sweeping the stage when he saw the great Jack Benny walk off early, and something about it had frightened him. He had grown up on this man's voice. He knew the rhythms of that radio show better than he knew his own family's dinner conversation. And seeing his hero leave the stage like that, head down, beaten, had felt to the boy like watching something that was not supposed to be possible. So he knocked, and when Jack told him to go away, the kid did not go away. He opened the door anyway. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what this boy said next. The kid stood in the doorway, shivering, holding his broom like he did not know what to do with his hands. And he looked at Jack Benny, his idol, the man he had grown up listening to on the floor of his family's house in Nebraska. And he saw that the man was crying. And instead of pretending he had not seen it, instead of backing out and closing the door, the kid said something. He said, and these are the 11 words that Jack Benny would carry to his grave. He said, "Mr. Benny, you didn't fail tonight. They just didn't deserve you." Jack Benny looked at the boy. He did not know what to say, and the kid, embarrassed now, talking too fast, kept going. He said that his whole family used to gather around the radio every Sunday, during the worst years anyone could remember, when there was no money and no good news, and the future looked like nothing at all. And that for 30 minutes every single Sunday, Jack Benny had made all of it disappear. He said that his mother, who almost never laughed at Jack Benny. He said that the radio was the one luxury they had refused to give up, even when there was nothing left, because 30 minutes on a Sunday night was worth more to them than anything money could buy. He said that on the worst week of all, the week they lost the farm, his father had sat in the dark with his head in his hands, and that the only sound in the house for days had been silence, until Sunday came and Jack Benny's voice filled the room, and his father laughed, really laughed for the first time in a month, and that the boy had watched it happen and understood, even at 12 years old, that what this man did was not small and it was not silly. It was a kind of medicine. It kept people standing when the world was trying to knock them down. He said that he had decided, lying on that floor as a boy, that whatever Jack Benny did, that was what he wanted to do with his life, to do for other people what this man had done for his family. And then the kid said the thing that would echo through 3 decades. He said, "What you do matters more than you'll ever know. Please don't stop." And then, mortified by his own boldness, the kid set down his broom, mumbled an apology, and left. He did not give his name. Jack did not ask for it. The boy was just one more anonymous face in one more freezing town. By the next morning, Jack Benny was on a train to the next city, and the encounter had folded itself into the blur of a hard tour. But here is the thing. Jack did not quit. He went to the next town, and the next, and somewhere in the middle of that brutal winter, the words a stranger had spoken in a cold doorway began to do their slow work. What you do matters more than you'll ever know. Jack Benny finished the tour. He went home. He picked up the work again. And slowly, season by season, he became Jack Benny once more. The institution, the legend, the man America could not imagine being without. But he never forgot the kid with the holes in his shoes. He never forgot the 11 words. And for 30 years in the back of his mind, he carried a quiet, impossible question. Whatever happened to that boy? He never spoke of it. There was no one left to tell, and besides, how do you explain to anyone that a stranger you met for 90 seconds in a freezing doorway was the reason you did not quit? The reason there were 30 more years of Sundays. The reason an entire generation of children got to grow up with your voice in their living rooms. It sounded absurd, said out loud. So Jack kept it where he kept everything that was too true to be funny, folded up and tucked away, and he carried on being the man the world expected him to be. The cheapskate, the terrible violinist, the vain old fool who claimed to be 39 forever. And only Jack knew that behind every one of those jokes was a man who had once been talked back from the edge of the dark by a boy with holes in his shoes, and who had spent 3 decades hoping somewhere that the boy had made it. Before we go any further, I want to take just a moment, because if this story is reaching you the way it seems to be reaching people, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. If you would like to go one step further and directly support these stories so we can keep making them, you can join this channel as a member using the join button below the video. It helps more than you know, and it keeps these forgotten moments alive for the people who need them. Thank you truly to everyone who has. Now let's get back to that stage, because the most extraordinary part is still to come. Now jump forward 30 years. To the Tonight Show stage, to the standing ovation, to the handshake that would not end. Because what almost nobody in that studio knew was that Jack Benny had spent the last several years quietly putting his affairs in order. His health was not what the public believed. He hid it the way he hid everything tender, behind a joke and a wave of the hand. But he knew. He knew that the appearances were getting fewer, that the road was getting shorter, and that there were things a man should say before the silence he had built his whole career around finally became permanent. And there was one thing he had never said, one debt he had never paid, one face he had spent 30 years trying to place, and then, one ordinary afternoon, watching television, it happened. Jack Benny was watching a younger man host a late-night program, a man with perfect timing and a patient smile, and a way of holding a silence that Jack recognized like his own reflection. And the host did a bit, a small thing, a long pause before a punchline, and tilted his head a certain way. And in that exact tilt, Jack Benny saw a ghost. He saw a kid in a doorway with a broom and holes in his shoes. He sat forward in his chair. His hands were shaking. It could not be. It was not possible. But the more he watched, the more certain he became. He watched that program every night after that, studying the host's face the way he had once studied his own, in the cracked mirror. He waited for the tilt of the head, the patient pause, the small private smile the man gave before a punchline landed, and every time he saw it, the certainty grew heavier in his chest. The voice was deeper now, a man's voice instead of a frightened boy's, but it was the same voice that had said 11 words in a freezing doorway. Jack started keeping a small notebook by his chair, jotting down each thing he noticed, building his case to himself like a man who could not quite believe his own evidence. The way the host folded his hands, the way he let a question hang in the air, the particular gentleness underneath the wit, the sense that he genuinely liked the people in front of him. It was all there. It was unmistakable. The boy who had saved his life in a freezing theater in 1948 had a name now. The whole country knew it. The boy was Johnny Carson. But here is what makes this almost unbearable. Johnny Carson did not remember. How could he? He had been 22 years old, exhausted, hungry, doing 100 small jobs in 100 small towns, trying to claw his way toward a dream. To him, that night had been nothing. A kind word to a sad man he admired. The kind of thing you say and forget by breakfast. Johnny Carson had gone on to become the most famous broadcaster alive. And somewhere along the way, the freezing theater and the cold dressing room and the crying legend had simply dissolved out of his memory entirely. He did not know. He had no idea that he, Johnny Carson, was the reason Jack Benny had not walked away. He had no idea he had ever touched the great man's life at all. And that is the secret Jack Benny carried into the studio that night. That is why he booked the appearance. Not to promote anything. Not to be funny. He came to pay a 30-year-old debt to a man who did not even know he was owed. And when he reached the desk and took Johnny's hand and felt the warmth of that grip, the whole speech he had prepared on the drive over simply evaporated. He had rehearsed it for days. He had it perfect, paragraph by paragraph, the way he prepared everything. And standing there, holding the hand of the boy who was a man now, every word of it left him at once. Everything he had wanted to say collapsed down into the only 4 words that mattered. He leaned in close, his mouth beside Johnny Carson's ear, and he whispered, "It was you, kid." And Johnny Carson's face went white. Because in that instant, with those 4 words, 30 years collapsed in on themselves. The freezing theater came flooding back, the cracked mirror, the broom in his hands, The crying man he had been too young and too foolish to be afraid of. The thing he had said and forgotten. It all came back at once. A lifetime arriving in a single second. And Johnny Carson understood for the first time in his life that the man he had idolized as a boy, the man whose silences he had spent a career imitating, had been carrying Johnny's own words inside him for 3 decades, like a stone in his pocket. That his small forgotten kindness had not been small at all. That it had reached forward across 30 years and was now standing in front of him with tears in its eyes. That is when Johnny pulled off his glasses and covered his face. That is when the most composed man in television came apart in front of the entire country. He sat there, both hands pressed to his face, his shoulders shaking, and he could not speak. A camera operator who had worked the show for years zoomed in slowly, on pure instinct, no director telling him to, and what he caught was something he said he never forgot for the rest of his life. He had seen Johnny Carson handle every kind of moment. He had never seen Johnny Carson cry, and here he was, weeping openly, while the gentlest old man in America stood beside him with one hand resting on his shoulder, waiting, patient, the way only a man who had built his life on patience could wait. The silence stretched on. 20 seconds, 30, 40. The audience did not know whether to laugh or cry, so they did neither. They sat in the kind of total stillness that only happens when a room full of strangers realizes, all at once, that they are watching something real, something that was not supposed to happen on television, something the cameras were never meant to capture. And then finally, Johnny Carson lowered his hands. His eyes were red and wet. He looked up at Jack Benny, and his voice, when it came, was not the smooth broadcast voice that had soothed a nation to sleep for years. It was the voice of a young man in Nebraska. It cracked, and he said, "I forgot. My God, Jack, I forgot all about it. How did you, after all these years, how did you remember?" His voice broke on the last word. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment, trying and failing to gather himself, the way you try to hold back a thing that is already crested. "I was a kid. I was nobody. I said something to you in a hallway because I couldn't stand to see you that way. And then I went and slept on a cot, and by morning, I'd forgotten it ever happened. How do you carry something for 30 years that the other person threw away by breakfast?" And Jack Benny, still standing, still holding Johnny's shoulder, finally let himself sit down in the guest chair. And he told America the story, not the violin jokes, not the cheapness, the real story. The winter tour, Daniel, the friend he had lost, the empty theater, the night he decided he was finished, and the boy with the broom and the holes in his shoes who had opened a door he had been told to leave closed, and who had said 11 words that had carried a broken man through the darkest season of his life. "I never knew your name," Jack said, his voice thin. "For 30 years I wondered what happened to that kid. And then I turned on my television one night, and there you were. The whole country's kid now, and you'd built the very thing you told me you wanted to build. You did for them exactly what I did for your family on those Sundays. And you never even knew it started in a freezing dressing room in the middle of nowhere. Because you'd already forgotten. You did the kindest thing anyone ever did for me, and it cost you so little you didn't even keep it. That's the part that breaks my heart, kid. You saved my life and you didn't even know you'd done it. Do you know what I thought about every night on that tour after you said it? I thought, if a boy that age, with nothing freezing in a borrowed coat, can stand in a doorway and give a stranger the only thing he had, which was the truth, then maybe I had no business quitting. Maybe the least I could do was keep showing up. So I did. Every time I wanted to stop for 30 years, I heard your voice in that doorway. You have no idea how many Sundays you bought for people, kid, because you didn't quit on me when I'd already quit on myself." The audience was crying now. All of them. You could hear it, a soft sound moving through the dark studio like wind through grass. Ed McMahon had his face turned away from the cameras, one hand over his eyes. And then Jack Benny reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out something small. A piece of paper worn soft and yellow at the edges, folded and refolded so many times, it had nearly come apart. He set it gently on the desk in front of Johnny. "What is it?" Johnny asked. "I wrote it down," Jack said. "The next morning on the train. Everything you said to me, word for word, while I could still remember it exactly. I didn't want to lose a single word of it. I've carried it for 30 years. He paused, and his patient smile finally returned, trembling but real. Turns out you weren't the only one who kept what mattered. You just forgot you'd given it away. Johnny Carson picked up the worn paper. He unfolded it with the kind of care you give to something that might fall to pieces in your hands. The creases had gone soft as cloth from 30 years of folding and unfolding. The ink had faded to the color of weak tea, and there, in a careful hand that was not his own, were his own words, copied down by a desperate man on a train in the dark so that he would never lose a single one of them. Johnny's lips moved as he read them silently, the words of a 22-year-old he had long ago stopped being. He read them once, then he read them again, slower, and he understood that he had been carried across his entire life by a kindness he never knew he had given, the same way Jack Benny had been carried by a kindness he never knew he would receive. Two men walking through 40 years apiece, each one quietly held up by the other, and neither one of them aware of it until this exact moment, under these exact lights, in front of the whole watching country. And Johnny Carson stood up. He came around the desk, the way he almost never did, and the two men, the old master and the kid who had idolized him, held each other in the middle of the stage, while 300 people in the studio and millions of people at home wept openly into the night. It was not a quick embrace, not the polite show business hug that ends in a pat on the back and a turn toward the camera. They held on. Jack Benny, who had spent a lifetime keeping the world at the precise distance of a punchline, let himself be held by a man who, 30 years ago, had been a boy he never expected to see again. And Johnny Carson, who had soothed an entire nation to sleep without ever letting one of them see his own face break, let it break completely in front of all of them, because some debts are too large to be paid in private. When they finally separated, Johnny wiped his face with the back of his hand and turned to the cameras, and his voice was steadier now, but only just. "Folks," he said, "I have sat at this desk for a long time. I have talked to presidents and movie stars and kings, and I have always told myself the same thing every single night, that you never know who is watching. You never know what someone out there needs to hear." He looked at Jack Benny. "I always thought I learned my whole career from this man. Turns out the most important thing either of us ever did, we did when nobody was watching at all. In a cold room, with no cameras, for no reason except that it was the decent thing to do." He swallowed hard. "So if you take one thing from tonight, take this. The kindness you think is small, the thing you'll forget by morning, it might be the thing that keeps a stranger alive for 30 years. You will never know, so do it anyway." The Tonight Show ran long that night. NBC received not a single complaint. The switchboard lit up before the broadcast had even ended, and the calls kept coming until dawn, not from fans of Jack Benny, and not from fans of Johnny Carson, but from people who had their own version of that freezing theater, people who had once said something to a stranger and never known if it landed, people who had once been the stranger, carried through a dark season by a kindness they could never repay, because they never learned the name of the person who gave it. The story moved through the country the way a true thing always does, quietly, person to person, until it had reached every corner. Letters arrived at NBC for months afterward, thousands of them, and almost none were about comedy. A woman wrote that she had called the high school teacher, who once told her she was worth something, a man she had not spoken to in 40 years, and that he had wept on the phone because no student had ever come back to tell him. A man wrote that he had finally tracked down the soldier who pulled him out of a river during the war, just to say the words he had carried since he was 19. A teenager wrote that he had decided not to do something that night after watching, because the show had reminded him that he could be somebody's Jack Benny one day, somebody's 11 words, and that he wanted to stay long enough to find out who. The producers later said they had never, in all the years of the program, received a response like it. Not for a movie star, not for a president, for two men and a folded piece of paper. Jack Benny made only a few more appearances after that night. His health, the thing he had hidden so well, finally caught up with the legend. And when he passed, among the tributes that poured in from every corner of the world, the one that drew the most attention was a short statement released quietly by Johnny Carson. It read, He taught me how to hold a silence. He never knew that once I taught him how to hold on. For 30 years, he carried 11 words I'd forgotten I ever said. I will carry the 4 words he gave me back for the rest of my life. It was you, kid. No, Jack, it was you. It was always you. And on Johnny Carson's desk for the rest of his career, tucked into a small wooden box where he kept the few things that were not for the public or the cameras, there was a single piece of paper worn soft and yellow, folded and refolded 1,000 times, carrying 11 words written in another man's hand. The words of a 22-year-old boy who never knew, until a legend whispered 4 words into his ear, that he had ever mattered to anyone at all. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person who said something kind to you once, years ago. A small thing they have surely forgotten, a word in a doorway, a sentence at exactly the right moment. The thing that quietly kept you going when you were colder and more alone than you ever told anyone. They probably do not know what they did. They probably forgot it by morning the way Johnny Carson forgot. That is the strange, beautiful, terrible truth of it. The people who change our lives almost never know they have done it, because the moment that saved us was, for them, just an ordinary Tuesday. A word, a door they did not have to open, a sentence they will never remember saying. Find them, call them, write to them, tell them, because somewhere out there is a person who carried your forgotten kindness for years, like a folded piece of paper in their pocket. And somewhere out there is a person you could carry. Tonight, with 11 words you will never remember saying. Do not wait 30 years to find out which one you are. If you have not subscribed yet, please do, so these stories keep finding you. Hit the like button so more people can find this one. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. And tell me about the person who once said the words that kept you here. Let's remember them together tonight.